Augustine's main repeated line of argument from his system may be summarized briefly as follows. Here's where Augustine got his original sin position from. All Christians agree that babies are baptized to regenerate them into Christ's body, the Catholic Church. First statement by Augustine. All Christians agree that the babies are baptized to regenerate them into Christ's body, which was the Catholic Church. Having made that statement, these are the two things that he got from it. First of all, this shows they are born under the guilt of sin committed in Adam. And I'll show you the scripture he used in a minute. He says, therefore, they are born under the guilt of sin in Adam. That's why they have to be baptized, to regenerate them into Christ's body. And secondly, the determination of who should be regenerated does not depend on the will of those selected. In other words, you get a baby and you baptize it. The baby has no say in that. Who has the say is the one who brings it to be baptized. Therefore, the salvation of the baby does not depend on the baby, it depends on the will of another. Augustine believed that it didn't matter really who baptized the baby, because if a drunken heretic baptized the baby would be saved by the faith of the church and not by the drunken heretic. But notice it was somebody else's will that was saving this baby. That's the argument he used. Now, we would think that it would go in reverse. In other words, that if babies are born under the guilt of sin in Adam, therefore you would... But his practice was to argue from the other side. This is a common teaching, therefore it shows these two things. Now, can you see from this point what happened? It was a very simple... It began to become a hard-line doctrine then. You must baptize a baby, or it will be damned. It will go to hell under the guilt of Adam. And secondly, salvation does not take place having anything to do with the choice of the person who gets saved. It has to do with the will of another. And then Augustine said, what is true of babies must also be true of adults. God selects some to be regenerated on some basis known only to him and not dependent on their own will. That's Augustine's main line of argument. This, if you like, is philosophical. It's not scriptural yet. We'll try and show you the scriptures that he tried to use. This is just, again, philosophical. Here we are. We're going to baptize a baby to save it. That proves two things. First, it needs to be saved, and it's not its own guilt. It must be the guilt of sin committed in Adam. Secondly, the fact that it's getting saved by somebody else means that salvation is not dependent on the choice of the person who's being saved, but on somebody else. What is true of babies must be true of adults. God must select some to regenerate them on some basis known only to himself, and that is why salvation comes about like that. Now, the early church never doubted the seriousness of Adam's fall, or Adam's sin, but Augustine gave it an entirely different interpretation. He taught that when Adam sinned, all his descendants sinned in Adam and so shared the guilt. Yeah, this is more scriptural now. Put scriptural in quotes. We have now dealt with, if you like, the reasoning from practical things. In other words, Augustine said, see what we do, we're baptizing babies. This proves a couple of things. Bam. Then, this is the scriptures he had to base this major line of argument on it. The support for Augustine's thought that all men sinned in Adam, and that's why they were guilty as babies, came from a Latin translation of Romans 5:12. I'm going to give you this in Latin and in Greek. Somebody want to read that from the King James or the New American Standard or any modern version? Who's got, anybody got the NASB, the American Standard? Read it out.
Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men, because all men sinned.
Because all men sinned. Now the phrase we're looking at, this phrase here, in Greek, translated because that, this is what Augustine had in his Latin version from Jerome. Watch. Any of you have ever taken Latin? You know what omnes means? This word is to be put to blame, percaverant. translated sin. And what do you think this phrase, translated literally in Latin, says? In whom all have sinned. That is the translation Augustine had sitting in front of him to build his theology from. In whom all have sinned. Now that word in whom, that phrase in whom, now remember, Augustine didn't have Greek, he only had Latin. He simply had that word, just like picking up a Living Bible and reading something there and you go, well, that's what it says. It says it here. This must be what it is. And this in whom can only refer to one person in this phrase, that's Adam. And so, Augustine was perfectly logical in finding a support, what he thought was a biblical support for his idea. Now, his philosophy said we all baptize babies. It shows there must have been, have some guilt. And that guilt can't come from there. It comes from somebody else. Aha, my Bible says here, in him all have sinned. Therefore, in Adam, all the human race have sinned. Federal head, if you want to call it that, since he was the head of the whole race, treated as, or sometimes because physically he was the father of the human race, then physically all the children from Adam are all sinners too. And are born like that and are treated guilty because of that. And sitting in front of him was a translation that said scripturally now that. Do you see? In other words, if you wanted to ask Augustine, where do you get this weird idea from? He'd say, weird, it's what the Bible teaches. And that's what I'm talking about. You can tell people, listen, this is what it says. And they go, well, my Bible doesn't say that. But the trouble is, that little reading, F-ho, was not contested for 1,000 years. It just sat there. And in that 1,000 years, the church wrote theology. For 1,000 years, the church wrote theology. And nobody even challenged it. It just sat there from Augustine all the way down to humanism. The translation was in whom. It was Erasmus who first pointed out that F-ho never means in whom, but because that. Which most of your translations, including the King James, have something like that. Nobody translates that today in whom. But Augustine had it like that. And from that base, 1,000 years of church theology was written. Augustine, Calvin, Luther, and so on.
The Latin was Jerome's.
Yeah, the Latin was Jerome's translation. Do you remember Jerome? The other one of those three guys that had the idea that God dispenses us grace according to what he foresees men will make of it out of all of the early church leaders, those three guys. Jerome was the one who gave Augustine the translation. Ambrose was his spiritual father, and Origen was the only other guy they had in the deal.